Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very relaxing. We're going to dim the lights, take a slow breath, and talk about teeth. Not your teeth, don't worry. We're drifting back to a time when toothpaste was made of crushed bones, mouthwash might contain urine, and the nearest thing to a dentist was probably your local blacksmith with some extra pliers lying around. Yes, tonight we're exploring medieval dentistry, or the medieval version of it, which was less dentistry and more grin and bear it while someone yanks a molar. Out with their knee on your chest. Romantic, isn't it? Now, I know teeth aren't exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you think of knights and castles, but actually, the mouth was a battlefield of its own. And trust me, medieval people had some of the worst dental luck imaginable. So let's tuck ourselves in and wander into a world of rotten gums, medieval cures, and a lot of bad breath. Because what's more relaxing than falling asleep to the sound of teeth cracking under rusty iron tools? Let's start with the basics. Medieval people did, in fact, have teeth. That part has not changed. But how those teeth looked, smelled, and functioned, well, that depended heavily on where you were born, how much bread you ate, and whether your parents were peasants, nobles, or somewhere in between. See, one thing historians like to argue about is whether medieval people actually had worse teeth than we do today. On one hand, sugar wasn't as common in Europe before the 1500s. No Coca-Cola, no gummy worms. On the other hand, medieval bread often contained ground-up stone dust from millstones, which were teeth down to nubs. Imagine eating a baguette and accidentally sanding your molars at the same time. Very chic. And while peasants probably had more worn teeth, nobles had the opposite problem: imported sugar. If you were wealthy enough to get your hands on candied fruits or sugar loaves from the Mediterranean, your teeth didn't last long. Archaeologists have dug up medieval skeletons from noble families, and some of them show cavities that look like someone tried to carve tunnels into their mouths. So basically it was bad either way. Now, you might be wondering, did they brush? Sort of. Medieval people were very resourceful when it came to oral hygiene. They didn't have Colgate, but they did have twigs, cloths, and the occasional herbal concoction. For instance, some manuscripts suggest wiping your teeth with a rough linen rag dipped in salt or crushed herbs. Because nothing says minty fresh like salty parsley rubbed directly onto your gums, there were also tooth powders, which were the medieval version of toothpaste. Recipes varied wildly. Some included ground-up animal bones, ashes, oyster shells, or even burnt breadcrumbs. Just imagine brushing with charcoal, except instead of a sleek $15 influencer brand, it's literally the leftovers from your fireplace. And if you were very, very unlucky, your local healer might recommend urine as a mouth rinse. Why? Because urine was considered sterile and had purifying properties. People genuinely believed it could cleanse the mouth. So somewhere in medieval Europe, someone definitely swished around a nice mouthful of their own pee before heading to a feast. Lovely, but the real fun came when prevention failed and things got infected. Because once you had an actual dental problem, say, an abscess, a rotting molar, or gums that looked like they'd lost a knife fight, you had limited options. The most obvious solution? Extraction. Pull the tooth out. Simple, right? Well, simple in theory. In practice, imagine sitting on a wooden stool while a barber, yes. Barbers doubled as dentists grabs a pair of iron pliers that look suspiciously like tools for fixing wagon wheels. He braces one knee on your chest, grips the rotten tooth, and pulls. No anesthesia. No numbing gel. Just raw human stubbornness. The tooth cracks, your gums tear, and if the barber was unlucky, half the tooth shatters, leaving shards embedded in your jaw, which, by the way, could cause an infection that might eventually kill you. Dentistry really was a high-stakes gamble. Let's float over to another curious figure in this story, the tooth drawers. These were traveling specialists who made their living yanking out teeth in town squares. Think of them as part dentist, part carnival act. They'd set up a stage, advertise their services, and pull teeth in front of an audience for dramatic effect. Because what better entertainment than watching someone scream in pain while a man in a colorful hat waves your bloody molar in the air? Some tooth drawers even carried around jars of teeth they collected, just to prove how skilled they were. And yes, that is as creepy as it sounds. Imagine paying a stranger to mutilate your mouth, and then he drops your tooth into his collection jar with a smug grin. Definitely the stuff of bedtime stories, but not everyone wanted to go the extraction route. Some medieval remedies aimed to cure toothaches without pulling. Spoiler alert, most of them were terrible. For example, one popular cure was to place a dead frog against your cheek and wait for the pain to transfer from your tooth to the frog. Apparently, frogs were seen as little pain sponges. Another option was to burn certain herbs, inhale the smoke, and hope it smoked out the pain. Which, if nothing else, probably left you lightheaded enough not to care. There were also recipes involving honey, vinegar, or even a paste made of brace yourself rooster droppings. Yes, people smeared chicken poop onto their gums. Presumably because they were desperate, or maybe because someone in the 12th century thought, this tastes foul, so it must be medicine. No. Speaking of desperation, let's talk about dental infections. Today, if you get an abscess, you see a dentist, get antibiotics, and maybe a root canal. In the Middle Ages, no antibiotics, no sterile tools, just swelling, pus, and a high chance of the infection spreading into your bloodstream. A toothache could actually kill you, and sometimes it did dot. There are records of kings and nobles suffering horribly from dental problems. For example, poor King Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, had nearly all his teeth pulled in the 1680s. He suffered so much pain that he couldn't chew properly, and pus constantly drained from his mouth. People at court said his breath was unbearable, which is a little awkward when you're supposed to be the glamorous center of the French universe, and Louis wasn't alone. Chronic bad teeth plagued many royals, because apparently you can have palaces, crowns, and armies, but you cannot escape the wrath of the cavity. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tonight, we're focusing mostly on the medieval era, roughly the 5th to 15th centuries before dentistry became even remotely professionalized. And in this time, a dentist was usually just a barber, a surgeon, or a random guy with a strong arm. Tools were basic, methods were painful, and the smell, well, let's not even go there. Still, people tried. They cared about their smiles, at least in theory. Courtly love poems mention white teeth as a sign of beauty. Medieval manuscripts advise keeping the mouth clean to avoid worms living inside the teeth. Yes, worms. People genuinely thought toothaches were caused by tiny worms gnawing away inside your molars. Some treatments even involved heating up a candle or metal rod and holding it near the tooth to smoke the worm out. Very scientific. And with that delightful image, I think we'll pause this section here. So far, we've wandered through medieval toothpaste recipes, barbers doubling as dentists, and the ever-popular frog on the cheek cure. Next, we'll drift further into the world of noble mouths, famous dental disasters, and the gradual, though still painful, evolution of dentistry, because as bad as the Middle Ages were, things somehow managed to get worse before they got better. Alright, let's settle back in. We've already poked around in the general dental toolbox of medieval Europe frogs, pliers, urine, and all the usual bedtime comforts. But now, let's float toward the people who could not escape the curse of bad teeth, no matter how rich. powerful or allegedly chosen by God they were. Yes, the royals, because as it turns out, the mouths of kings and queens were often just as rotten as the rest of their policies. Let's begin with a favorite, Queen Elizabeth I of England. By the time she was older, Elizabeth's teeth were in such rough shape that foreign ambassadors politely noted how foul her breath was. Now, imagine being a dignitary from Spain or France, trying to negotiate peace while the Virgin Queen beams at you with a mouth full of blackened stumps. Very regal. The reason? Sugar. Elizabeth adored candied sweets. Imported sugar was a status symbol, and naturally, she indulged in it like it was her job. Historians note that by her later years, her teeth were dark, decayed, and often painful. One poor bishop who visited her court apparently complained that it was difficult to understand her speech, her words slurred because her gums were in constant agony. There are even accounts suggesting she became self-conscious about smiling, which honestly is relatable if your entire dental situation could double as a Halloween prop. But Elizabeth wasn't alone. Her father, Henry VIII, had his own set of gnarly dental problems. Shocking, right? The man who weighed nearly 400 pounds by the end of his life didn't exactly prioritize flossing. He reportedly lost several teeth early on and suffered from recurring oral infections. Not that it stopped him from devouring massive feasts of roasted meats and sticky puddings. You know, the kinds of foods that wedge themselves right into your gums. Some sources suggest Henry had constant toothaches, which may have added to his famously bad temper, which is not ideal when you're the kind of king who solves problems by chopping off wives' heads. Imagine his advisors whispering, "He's in a worse mood than usual today." Maybe it's the molar. Now, while English royals were chewing themselves into misery, their continental cousins weren't faring much better. Take Philip II of Spain, for example. A king known for his strict Catholic piety, gloomy personality, and of course, terrible teeth. Reports say his mouth was riddled with cavities, and his breath could knock out an entire courtier from 3 feet away. Which might explain why he preferred solitude and endless paperwork. Then, there's the delightful case of the Habsburg dynasty, the European family tree that basically folded in on itself from too much inbreeding. The Habsburg jaw is infamous. That heavy, protruding chin and drooping lower lip you see in their portraits. But behind those majestic chins, dental nightmares, overcrowded teeth, misaligned bites, and chewing difficulties so bad that some Habsburgs reportedly struggled to speak or eat properly. Poor Charles II of Spain, the ultimate inbred disaster, could barely chew his food. He had so many dental deformities that he drooled constantly. Court reports described him as unable to form words properly because of his jaw and teeth. And keep in mind, this was the man ruling the Spanish Empire. Armadas, colonies, and all. Yet chewing bread was a challenge. Let's drift back to France for a moment, because no royal dental tour would be complete without Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. We already mentioned his ordeal with extractions, but let's go deeper in the 1680s. Louis developed such severe tooth decay that his surgeons decided to remove almost all his teeth. Unfortunately, they weren't exactly gentle about it. During one botched extraction, they accidentally tore a hole between his mouth and his nasal cavity. This meant that whenever the king tried to drink, liquid leaked out his nose. Not exactly the image of royal dignity, still, Louis powered through. He continued to host elaborate feasts, court rituals, and war councils, all while being unable to chew properly, constantly battling infection and occasionally dribbling wine from his nostrils. But hey, he had Versailles, so who's really complaining? Speaking of infections, let's pause here to remember that before modern dentistry, every toothache had the potential to spiral into something much worse. A royal toothache could quickly become a royal death sentence. Take Edward the Black Prince, son of King Edward III of England. Some historians speculate that part of his mysterious illness may have been linked to chronic dental infections. His health declined slowly and painfully, and while we can't say it was all about his teeth, there's a decent chance rotten gums played a supporting role. Even more grim, there are scattered accounts of noble children dying young, not just from plague or measles, but from abscesses that spread into the bloodstream. Imagine being a prince in a palace, surrounded by gold, tapestries, and servants, and still losing the battle to a single infected molar dot now. While royals had access to the best care money could buy, sometimes that care was worse than doing nothing. Court surgeons often experimented with new techniques, which usually meant trial and error on the mouths of kings. For example, one 15th century French surgeon recommended drilling into the tooth with a hot metal rod to kill the tooth worm. Not exactly the spa treatment dot, and then there were the endless poultices. Nobles had herbalists who whipped up concoctions of sage, clove, and vinegar, smeared directly onto the gums. Some of these may have offered mild relief. Others included more questionable ingredients, like powdered coral or crushed emeralds. Yes, actual gemstones. Because what's the point of being king if you can't rub ground-up jewelry into your gums while screaming in agony? Of course, not all remedies were so glamorous. Some were downright embarrassing. Records from various royal households suggest urine was not just a peasant cure. Even nobles used it as a dental rinse, which is unfortunate. Picture the grandeur of Versailles with fountains, gilded halls, and courtiers bowing low while somewhere a royal physician is advising the king to gargle with a fresh sample. Truly majestic. What's fascinating, though, is that bad teeth also became part of royal image management. Elizabeth I, for instance, reportedly refused to have some teeth pulled because she feared it would make her look weak. Image was everything. The Virgin Queen could never admit defeat to something as humiliating as a molar. Louis XIV, despite his horrifying dental ordeal, still sat for portraits that presented him as the radiant Sun King, perfectly composed, even if his mouth was a war zone. And the Habsburgs? Well, they leaned into it. That jutting jaw became a dynastic badge of honor proof of pure royal blood. Even if it also meant lifelong chewing problems. So what we see in the medieval and early modern royal world is a strange paradox. On the one hand, teeth were a constant source of pain and humiliation. On the other, they were tied to power, image, and even dynastic pride. Bad breath could ruin a marriage negotiation. A missing tooth could fuel rumors about weakness. Yet the show had to go on, no matter how much it hurt Dot, and honestly, maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. Pretending everything's fine while your mouth is slowly rotting from the inside. Let's drift to a gentler close for this section. We floated past Elizabeth's blackened smile, Henry VIII's toothache tantrums, the dribbling Sun King, and the drooling Habsburgs. All proof that no amount of crowns, armies, or divine right can protect you from the eternal enemy. Black Dot in the next part will wander into the world of folk beliefs, tooth charms, and the weirdly magical side of medieval dentistry. Because when science fails, superstition always steps in, and nothing says bedtime quite like whispering about tooth worms under the candlelight. Welcome back. We've shuffled past royal mouths crumbling like old plaster, and now it's time to dim the lights a little more and wander into the stranger, softer corners of medieval dental lore. Because when medicine was limited to pliers, urine rinses, and prayers, people turned to something far more comforting, superstition. And let's be honest, if you had a screaming toothache and someone told you it was caused by a tiny worm gnawing at your molar, you might actually believe it. Anything is better than admitting you're at the mercy of bacteria you can't even see. So let's start with the infamous toothworm theory. This idea was so widespread in the medieval world that you'll find it in manuscripts, charms, and even old medical treatises. Basically, people thought toothaches were caused by little worms burrowing inside your teeth. If you had pain, it was because the worm was wriggling. If the pain stopped, the worm had fallen asleep. Very cute. Very wrong. And, of course, the treatments matched the theory. Healers tried to smoke out the worm by burning herbs near the tooth or holding a hot needle close to it. Some even dripped honey or oil into the cavity, hoping to lure the worm out like it was a garden pest. I imagine the patient sitting there, mouth wide open, while everyone stares at the tooth, waiting for a tiny worm to crawl out. Spoiler, it never did. Still, the worm theory hung around for centuries. In fact, it shows up in folklore from ancient Mesopotamia all the way into the 18th century. That's how sticky the idea was, like plaque, but for the human imagination, of course. Worms weren't the only magical explanation. Sometimes toothaches were blamed on curses, evil spirits, or even planetary misalignment. Because obviously, if Saturn was in a bad mood, your molars were going to pay the price. That's where charms came in. People carried little amulets against toothache bits of bone, carved stones, or religious medals blessed by priests. Some charms had verses written on them, like miniature prayers folded into cloth and tied around the neck. If you believed hard enough, the pain might just fade. Or at least, you'd be distracted enough to get through the day. One particularly strange cure involved transferring the pain to another object, or better yet, to an animal. Some medieval texts would suggest spitting into a frog's mouth, declaring that the toothache was now the frog's problem, and then releasing it back into the wild. Which, if nothing else, gave frogs a very confusing day. Other traditions recommended burying a tooth, often with a ritual or prayer. The idea was to lock away the pain in the ground. Sometimes the tooth was buried near a churchyard, sometimes under the hearthstone of the house. Because clearly, nothing says good dental health like hiding teeth under your living room floorboards. Let's drift for a moment into the darker side. Toothache saints. Yes, there were saints you could pray to for relief from dental agony. One of the most popular was Saint Apollonia, a 3rd century martyr whose teeth were supposedly smashed out during her execution. Naturally, she became the go-to figure for anyone with a toothache. Medieval folks lit candles to her, wore her image on pendants, and begged her for mercy. It's oddly poetic. She lost all her teeth, so now she's forever in charge of protecting everyone else's. A bit grim. But hey, when your mouth feels like it's on fire, you'll take any patron saint you can get, but saints weren't the only supernatural help. Sometimes people went straight to astrology. Medieval medical texts often included charts showing which zodiac signs ruled which body parts. Teeth, of course, were linked to certain planets. So if Mercury was in retrograde, maybe it wasn't the worm's fault after all. Maybe the stars just wanted you to suffer, and yes, some medieval barbers and surgeons actually timed extractions based on astrology. You didn't want to risk pulling a tooth when Mars was ascendant, because clearly that would end in disaster. Never mind the rusty pliers and lack of anesthesia, the real danger was the moon phase. Let's float into another bizarre but oddly cozy tradition, tooth offerings. In some places, children's lost teeth were offered to animals, spirits, or even household gods. The logic was simple. If you gave your tooth to something powerful, it might reward you with strong, healthy adult teeth. This tradition eventually morphed into things like the tooth fairy in later centuries. But in medieval times, it could be much stranger. Some Scandinavian traditions involved giving your tooth to a mouse because mice had strong teeth and might pass that strength on. which is charming but also slightly terrifying if you imagine a mouse army fueled by human baby teeth. And then, of course, there were the recipes, because no medieval problem was complete without a bizarre home remedy. Herbal manuals are filled with instructions for soothing toothaches. Some are fairly reasonable cloves, for example, which actually do have mild numbing properties. Others, less so. One English manuscript recommends boiling a mixture of sage, pepper, and vinegar, then holding it in your mouth until the pain subsides. Another suggests chewing on crushed beetles, because nothing says fresh breath like insect guts, and my personal favorite, rubbing your gums with powdered dog skull. Yes, you had to find a deceased dog, grind its skull into dust, and apply liberally. It's hard to imagine anyone doing this calmly, but apparently it was a thing. Medieval people were nothing if not committed to trying everything once. Now, you might be wondering, did any of this actually work? The answer is occasionally by accident. Cloves helped a little. Heat sometimes numbed nerves. But mostly, these rituals offered comfort through belief. If you trusted the charm, or prayed to the right saint, or buried your tooth in the right spot, you might convince yourself the pain was lighter. Placebo wrapped in incense and folklore. And honestly, that's not nothing. Sometimes when you're in agony, belief itself is medicine. What's striking is how communal these practices were. Toothaches weren't private struggles. They were shared with family, neighbors, and even entire villages. Someone would suggest a charm, someone else would recite a prayer, and maybe the local wise woman would recommend rubbing sheep fat on your gums. It sounds odd to us, but back then it was part of the rhythm of life. And if nothing worked, well, then it was time to calm the tooth drawer, brace yourself on that wooden stool, and hope the worm finally came out with a tooth. Let's ease toward the end of this section. We've drifted through tooth forms, frog cures, saintly prayers, and powdered dog skulls. All reminders that medieval dentistry wasn't just about pain, it was about meaning. People needed explanations. They needed hope. And they found it in the strange, magical corners of their world. In the next part, we'll slide gently into the early professionalization of dentistry. The moment when barbers started branding themselves as surgeons, when tooth pulling became a career, and when people slowly, painfully, began to understand what was actually going on inside the human mouth, which, as you might guess, was still pretty disgusting. But hey, we're getting closer to toothbrushes, so it's progress. So far, we've floated through vorms, charms, and royal mouths that could curdle milk at 10 paces. Now, let's wander into the slightly more organized side of medieval tooth care. And by organized, I mean barbers with sharp knives and questionable hygiene who decided, somewhere along the line, that they were qualified to yank your molars out between haircuts, because nothing says confidence like someone trimming your beard. One moment, and then digging around in your gums with the same hands. Let's start with the barber surgeons. In the medieval period, barbers were already in the business of cutting hair, beards, and, when asked nicely, skin. They carried razors, knives, and scissors, so naturally they became the go-to people for minor surgery. Need a bloodletting? A quick stitch? A mole removed? The barber was your man. And of course, this included dentistry. After all, if you could shave a chin, why not shave a little enamel too? Barbers developed a reputation for pulling teeth, often using tools that looked more at home in a blacksmith shop than a medical kit. One of their favorite gadgets was called a dental key. It looked a bit like a door key, but with a sharp claw at the end. The barber would hook it around the tooth, twist, and ideally yank the whole thing out. Of course, in practice, the key often shattered the tooth into jagged shards. But hey, details. The barber's shop became a sort of multi-purpose clinic. People would sit in chairs, wait their turn, and watch someone get a shave while the next unlucky soul braced for an extraction. And you thought waiting at the modern dentist was stressful. At least you don't have to listen to the guy before you screaming while your hygienist sharpens her tools. But barbers weren't the only ones in the business. Enter the tooth drawers. These were more like traveling showmen than doctors. They roamed from town to town, set up in marketplaces, and offered extractions as public entertainment. Imagine a medieval fair. Jugglers, musicians, maybe a dancing bear, and right in the middle, a tooth drawer pulling out someone's molar while the crowd cheers. Tooth drawers loved theatrics. They wore flashy clothes, shouted about their skills, and sometimes pretended to be official doctors with impressive sounding titles. After yanking a tooth, they might wave it around like a trophy before tossing it into a jar already full of dozens of others. Proof of skill, or maybe just proof that they were collecting props. And, of course, the louder the patient screamed, the better the show. Now, if you're wondering about hygiene, the answer is simple. There wasn't any. Tools weren't sterilized. Hands weren't washed. Sometimes the tooth drawer would wipe his pliers on his trousers before moving on to the next patient, which meant infection spread easily. You might lose your tooth, yes, but you also might lose your life a few weeks later to sepsis. But still, people lined up. Because when the pain was unbearable, you'd take your chances with the guy shouting in the town square. Meanwhile, in wealthier circles, medicine was starting to professionalize very slowly. University-trained physicians existed, but they considered tooth care beneath them. Pulling teeth was too messy, too manual, and frankly, too undignified. They preferred to write long treatises in Latin about balancing humors while sipping wine. So dentistry remained stuck with the hands-on professions, barbers, surgeons, and traveling specialists, which meant progress was glacial. That said, there were a few bright sparks of innovation. By the late Middle Ages, some surgical manuals began including detailed sections on dental problems. They described methods for extracting teeth, treating abscesses, and even crafting rudimentary dentures. Yes, dentures. The materials. Wood, ivory, and occasionally human teeth scavenged from the recently dead. Because nothing says luxury like wearing your neighbor's molars in your mouth. These dentures were clunky, uncomfortable, and prone to falling out mid-feast. But for nobles desperate to maintain a full smile, it was better than nothing. Speaking of nobles, remember Louis XIV and his unfortunate nasal week? His surgeons were part of this slow shift toward dentistry as a distinct medical craft. They may not have had anesthesia, but they did start experimenting with more careful techniques, like using specially shaped forceps instead of generic pliers. Progress, if you ignore the pus. Of course, not everyone was so forward-thinking. In rural areas, people still relied on folk healers and village cunning women. These practitioners mixed herbal remedies, charms, and occasionally minor surgery. Some actually knew useful tricks like applying clove oil to numb pain. Others leaned harder into the magical side, prescribing chants, amulets, or frog-based therapy. It was a bit of a lottery, but that was medieval healthcare in general. Half wisdom, half wild guess, all trial and error. Now, let's pause for a moment on one detail we've skimmed past: the sheer spectacle of dental pain in public life. Because in a world without anesthetics, extractions were not private. They were loud, messy, and often communal. Neighbors watched. Crowds gathered. Sometimes tooth pullings doubled as moral lessons. See that man screaming? That's what happens when you send too much sugar. It sounds cruel, but it also reinforced the idea that pain was part of life. Teeth hurt. You suffered. And then you carried on if you survived the barber's pliers. There's also something almost symbolic about it. Medieval society was obsessed with the body as a site of sin and punishment. The mouth, especially, was tied to morality. Gossips, gluttons, liars, they all sinned with the mouth. So when someone suffered a toothache, it wasn't just physical. It was almost poetic justice. The mouth that lied or gorged was now the mouth in agony, even if in reality, the poor guy probably just had too much gritty bread stuck in his molars. But let's not give the Middle Ages too hard a time. By the 15th century, a few serious attempts at dental knowledge began to circulate. Translations of Arabic medical texts brought new ideas into Europe. Surgeons started to understand that infections could spread from teeth to the rest of the body. Some even described how to drain abscesses. Though the methods were still brutal, it was, in short, the messy teenage years of dentistry. Too advanced to rely only on frog charms, but not advanced enough to save you from screaming in a barber's chair, as the centuries turned. Dentistry would continue this slow, bloody crawl toward professionalism. But in the Middle Ages, it remained stuck in that strange middle ground, half medicine, half sideshow, half superstition. Yes, that's three halves, but medieval math wasn't much better than their dentistry. So, to gently close this section, picture the barber shop. The striped pole outside red for blood, white for bandages, spinning in the wind. Inside, a man sharpens his razor while a nervous customer waits. Maybe he's there for a haircut. Maybe for a molar. Either way, the tools are the same, and somewhere outside, in the bustling market, a tooth drawer shouts promises of quick relief. A crowd gathers. Someone screams. And the medieval world keeps turning, one rotten tooth at a time. In the next part, we'll drift into the Renaissance and early modern era, where dentistry begins to resemble something closer to what we know today. Still painful, still disgusting, but finally, with a few glimmers of progress like toothbrushes that weren't made of soot and rags, which, by medieval standards, is practically a miracle. Okay, we've survived barbers with pliers, tooth worms hiding in molars, and frogs pressed against cheeks. Now, let's quietly step into the Renaissance. That magical time when people rediscovered classical knowledge, painted ceilings, and invented printing presses. You might think this would also be the moment they figured out dentistry, and kind of, not really. They made progress, yes, but they also clung to some pretty revolting habits. Let's stroll through it slowly. First, let's talk about toothbrushes. The Renaissance gets credit for spreading the first real ones in Europe. But here's the fun twist. The idea wasn't European at all. It came from China. By the late 1400s, Chinese craftsmen were attaching bristles, usually hog hair, to bamboo or bone handles. Essentially an early toothbrush. These nifty tools traveled west along trade routes, eventually reaching wealthy Europeans in the 16th century. And of course, nobles were fascinated. Imagine a courtier showing off, "Look at my imported hog hair brush." It scrubs the plaque right off. Very fashionable, but for most people, brushing still meant rubbing teeth with a rag dipped in salt, ash, or crushed herbs. The toothbrush was luxury. And even when people had one, the bristles weren't exactly pleasant. Hog hair was stiff, sharp, and sometimes full of grease. Not quite the soft nylon we know today. Still progress. Then we have tooth powders, which got more elaborate in the Renaissance. Apothecaries sold blends of spices, salts, and minerals. Some recipes were genuinely helpful mild abrasives that could polish enamel. Others were disasters, like powders made of ground pumice or coral, which basically sanded your teeth into oblivion. You'd get a bright smile for a while, until the enamel wore away and your teeth collapsed. And because nobles loved extravagance, some powders included powdered pearls or even gold dust. Nothing screams dental health like scrubbing your gums with money. Now, while peasants stuck to twigs and ashes, elites started obsessing over the look of their teeth. A white smile became fashionable, at least in some courts. But the irony was brutal. The more sugar they ate, the blacker their teeth became. In fact, black teeth briefly turned into a weird status symbol. By the 16th century, sugar was so strongly associated with wealth that having dark, decayed teeth actually proved you were rich enough to indulge. There are records of courtiers even blackening their teeth artificially to imitate the look. Imagine deliberately painting cavities onto your molars because it made you look fancy. That's Renaissance logic for you. Of course, fashion aside, the real problem was pain. Cavities, infections, and abscesses were everywhere. And while Renaissance physicians started to take an interest in the subject, the actual treatments were still medieval in spirit. Extractions remained the go-to. But now, instead of just barbers and tooth drawers, you had surgeons trying to professionalize the process. They published books with illustrations of dental tools, forceps, scalers, and even drills. The drawings looked terrifying, like torture devices from a dungeon, which in a way they were. Let's float gently into the world of dentures again. By the Renaissance, demand was rising. Nobles couldn't exactly attend court with gaping smiles, so craftsmen experimented with better prosthetics. Human teeth were still popular, collected from corpses, prisoners, or even poor people who sold their molars for cash. These were wired into wooden or ivory bases, sometimes with springs to keep them in place. Springs, by the way, were a terrible idea. They made the dentures constantly snap shut. Imagine trying to chew politely at a banquet while your fake teeth are bouncing around like a bear trap. Very refined. Now, if you've been waiting for a famous dental disaster, here's a good one. Catherine de' Medici, the French queen and mother of 3 kings, was obsessed with preserving her appearance, but she also adored sugary confections. The result: by her later years, her teeth were described as dark, painful, and decayed. Ambassadors at court whispered about the queen's foul breath. Imagine being the most powerful woman in France, negotiating political alliances, while everyone in the room is silently praying you'd use a mint. And then there's Charles IX of France, one of Catherine's unfortunate sons. He died young, at 23, but even in his short life, he managed to suffer chronic dental pain. Some historians believe abscesses contributed to his overall poor health. Once again, royalty proved no match for bacteria. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Tudors weren't doing much better. We already mentioned Elizabeth, the first blackened smile, but her courtiers were far behind. Sugar had become the Tudor obsession. Sweetened wines, candied fruits, and elaborate desserts were everywhere, which meant toothaches became practically a national pastime. It got so bad that physicians wrote treatises warning about sugar's dangers, not for diabetes, but for teeth. They didn't know about bacteria, but they could see the correlation. More sugar, more cavities. Did this stop anyone? Of course not. Nobles doubled down, because if suffering meant proving your wealth, then what's a little pus and agony? Let's wander over to folk practices during this period. While elites experimented with bristly hog hair brushes, peasants kept their traditions. Chewing sticks, herbal rinses, charms, and yes, urine rinses lingered. Old habits die hard, especially when hog hair toothbrushes cost more than your annual rent. There are even accounts of soldiers in the 16th century cleaning their teeth with gunpowder, which works as an abrasive but also fills your mouth with sulfur. Nothing like a blast of rotten egg breath to strike fear into your enemies, slowly. Though the Renaissance laid the groundwork for dentistry as a true profession. Universities began offering surgical training that included dental chapters. Books circulated with detailed diagrams of jaws and teeth. Anatomists dissected skulls to study dental structures. One of the most important names was Ambroise Paré, a French surgeon in the 16th century. He's often called the father of modern surgery, and he wrote extensively about dental problems. He described methods for treating cavities, building dentures, and even wiring loose teeth in place. Granted, his solutions were still painful, but at least he tried. Baby steps, what's fascinating here is the contrast. On one hand, you had surgeons like Pear carefully sketching dental instruments and writing Latin treatises. On the other, you had tooth drawers still performing bloody extractions in town squares for applause. Renaissance dentistry was split between science and spectacle, progress and pain, and somehow both approaches coexisted. Let's float toward a softer close for this part. Picture a Renaissance noble sitting in a candlelit chamber. On the table, a porcelain cup of spiced wine, a silver box of candied almonds, and a hog-hair toothbrush carved from ivory. They smile, showing off teeth blackened with decay, but it doesn't matter. Black teeth mean sugar. Sugar means wealth. Wealth means power. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, a peasant wipes his mouth with a rag dipped in ashes, shrugs, and gets on with his day. Two worlds. Same TOOTHHE dot in the next part. We'll drift into the 17th and 18th centuries, when dentistry finally started to resemble a real medical field. Anesthesia was still a long way off, but at least someone finally figured out you don't need to rub dog skulls on your gums. Progress, indeed. Alright, let's float gently forward into the 1600s and 1700s. Europe is entering the Age of Wigs, powdered faces, and way too much perfume. You've got Louis XIV ruling France with his golden slippers. England is experimenting with parliamentary drama. And across the Atlantic, colonists are busy founding new settlements, but through all this political noise, people's teeth are still quietly rotting. And dentistry, while inching toward modernity, remains a weird hybrid of science, spectacle, and sheer pain. First, let's talk about the rise of tooth drawers. We've met them before in the Middle Ages, pulling teeth in market squares for cheering crowds. By the 17th century, they were still at it, but with more flair. They weren't just pulling molars. They were entertainers. Imagine a man in a brightly colored coat juggling his forceps, cracking jokes, and yanking out teeth while fiddlers played in the background. Crowds loved it. Pain was theater. Blood was proof of success. Some tooth drawers even advertised with banners, painted with giant teeth and happy faces like medieval dentists doubling as carnival barkers. And because medical licensing wasn't exactly standardized, anyone with a strong arm and a pair of pliers could call himself a dental expert. Not reassuring, but the 17th century also gave us the first people who genuinely tried to professionalize the field. They called themselves dentists, borrowing from the French. And they wanted to separate their work from barbers and carnival performers. The most famous of them was Pierre Fauchard, often called the father of modern dentistry. He published Le Chirurgien Dentiste in 1728, a massive book full of diagrams, tools, and treatments. It was revolutionary. Instead of just yanking out teeth, he described ways to fill cavities, straighten teeth, and even transplant them. Granted, his transplants involved taking teeth from one person and sticking them into another's jaw, which usually failed because infection. But hey, points for creativity. Fauchard also emphasized prevention, encouraging people to clean their teeth regularly and avoid excessive sugar. A radical idea at the time, though one that royals completely ignored. Speaking of royals, let's float over to Louis XIV's court in Versailles. The Sun King was famous for luxury, but his personal dental health was catastrophic. He had chronic problems, multiple abscesses, and decayed teeth that caused him enormous pain. At one point, surgeons extracted so many teeth that part of his upper jawbone came away too. This left a hole between his mouth and nasal cavity, which meant that when he drank soup, it sometimes came out his nose, and yet Louis continued ruling with perfect poise, wigs towering above his head, as courtiers politely pretended not to notice his leakage problem. That's dedication to image. Now, let's glide across the channel to England. Queen Elizabeth I may have died in 1603, but her dental legacy carried into the Stuart period. Sugar remained wildly popular, so tooth decay was basically a national disease. One of the most famous English cases comes from Samuel Pepys, the diarist. He recorded in his journal the misery of toothaches, describing how he tried to endure the pain while attending Parliament or social gatherings. At one point, he finally had a tooth pulled and noted the most cruel pain, followed by blessed relief. His diaries are full of naval battles and political gossip, and also endless complaints about teeth. Now, let's drift into the world of dentures again, because the 18th century really went all in on them. Ivory dentures became more refined, sometimes carved from hippopotamus ivory. Still not comfortable, but sturdier than wood. Human teeth remained in demand too. Dentists would literally advertise for volunteers willing to sell their molars. Poor people lined up, exchanging teeth for coin. The practice got so common that the wealthy referred to them as live teeth, as opposed to the dead teeth from corpses. If you could afford fresh, living teeth, you had the dental equivalent of luxury leather. Disturbing, but socially acceptable. Of course, not every attempt at dental progress was successful. There were still plenty of weird remedies floating around. In the 1600s, one English recipe suggested boiling dog skulls, grinding them into powder, and applying that to sore gums. Another cure advised rinsing with wine mixed with human urine, because apparently no one could let go of the urine thing. And then there was the enduring belief in the toothworm. Yes, even in the 17th century, some people still thought cavities were caused by little worms burrowing inside. It wasn't until microscopes revealed bacteria that the worm theory finally died. Now, let's float to the colonies for a moment. In early America, dentistry was rudimentary. Most settlers relied on the same old remedies: extractions with crude tools, herbal rinses, and home cures. Professional dentists were rare, so barbers and blacksmiths often did the job. Imagine getting a molar yanked by the same guy who fixed your horse's shoes. Comforting. But by the 1700s, things improved. Traveling dentists advertised in colonial newspapers, offering extractions, fillings, and artificial teeth. Some even carried little portable chairs and toolkits, setting up shop in taverns or private homes. Dentistry was still painful, but at least it was becoming recognized as its own craft. Let's circle back to Europe. By the 18th century, dentistry was fashionable enough that aristocrats hired private dentists. And of course, the tools were getting more sophisticated. Metal forceps, pelican-shaped extractors, and even early drills existed. None of them were pleasant. Without anesthesia, every procedure was agony. Imagine sitting in a silk gown, clutching the arm of a velvet chair, while a dentist calmly drills into your molar with a hand-crank device. No numbing, just pressure, vibration, and pain. And yet, this was progress compared to the chaos of earlier centuries. One famous patient of 18th century dentistry was George Washington. By the time he became president, he had lost most of his teeth. Contrary to myth, they weren't wooden. His dentures were made of ivory, gold, and lead, with human and animal teeth fitted in. They were bulky, uncomfortable, and often made his lips bulge awkwardly. Washington hated them, but wore them anyway, because appearances mattered. Imagine leading a revolution, commanding armies, founding a nation, and all the while dealing with a mouthful of creaky, mismatched dentures. Truly heroic. The 18th century also gave us the beginnings of dental education. In 1745, the company of surgeons in London separated from barbers, marking the start of surgery as its own profession. Dentistry followed the same trend. Fauchard's book inspired a generation of practitioners who saw teeth as more than carnival curiosities. By the late 1700s, dental manuals were being translated into English, German, and Italian. Middle-class families began thinking of dental care as part of respectability. And while most people still lost their teeth young, at least there was an emerging sense that prevention mattered. Let's slow the pace here and close this part softly. Picture an 18th century salon in Paris. The chandeliers glow, wigs tower, and conversation flows over glasses of sweet wine. In the corner, a dentist carefully displays his ivory-handled instruments. A lady of fashion leans in, asking about a new set of dentures, while a gentleman boasts that he had a tooth transplanted just last week. It's all elegance on the surface. But behind the lace and silk, jaws ache, abscesses throb, and everyone secretly dreads the day they'll need another molar pulled. Dentistry was becoming modern, but it was still disgusting, painful, and deeply human. In the next part, we'll drift into the 19th century when anesthesia finally entered the scene, and dental chairs became more than just places of torture. Progress was on the horizon, though it remained full of blood and misery. Alright, we're leaving powdered wigs behind and floating into the 19th century. It's the era of trains, factories, and Dickensian misery. Coal smoke fills the air, corsets get tighter, and Queen Victoria sits on the throne for most of it. And through all of this industrial progress, people's teeth are still rotting. The difference now is that dentistry finally had a few new tricks. Some of them even worked. First up, the big one, anesthesia. Before the 1800s, having a tooth pulled was pure, unfiltered agony. You sat down, clenched your fists, and screamed into a rag while someone yanked. But in 1844, a dentist named Horace Wells demonstrated the use of nitrous oxide laughing gas for dental surgery. Suddenly, extractions didn't have to be a living nightmare. 2 years later, another dentist, William Morton, showed off ether anesthesia in Boston. And from then on, dentistry began its slow march toward something tolerable. Patients could finally drift away into unconsciousness instead of thrashing in the chair. Though to be fair, not every attempt worked. Some patients still woke up mid-procedure, which must have been a rude surprise. At the same time, the 19th century was the age of industrial sugar. Cane sugar production exploded with global trade, and suddenly sweets weren't just for nobles. Middle-class families could afford them, and even the working poor indulged. The result? Cavities everywhere. If you think Victorian novels are full of melancholy and illness, remember that behind the scenes, almost everyone was dealing with dental pain. Toothaches were practically a national epidemic. And because appearances mattered more than ever, this was the age of photographs. After all dentists saw booming business, speaking of appearances, let's talk about dentures again. By the Victorian period, they were more sophisticated but still unsettling. Ivory remained common, but dentists also experimented with porcelain teeth. These looked beautifully white, sometimes unnaturally so, like rows of tiny china plates. Porcelain dentures had one problem: they were brittle. If you bit down too hard, they could shatter. Imagine attending a genteel dinner party, smiling gracefully, and suddenly crunching your way through your own dentures. Very elegant. George Washington, of course, had already made false teeth infamous, but Victorians took them to new levels. By mid-century, full sets of porcelain or ivory teeth were status symbols. And they weren't cheap. If you could flash a gleaming white smile, everyone knew you had money. And probably a mouth full of pain. Now, one of the strangest industries of the 19th century was the market for human teeth. Soldiers killed in battle were often robbed of their molars by scavengers. These were sold to dentists and called Waterloo teeth after the famous Battle of 1815. For decades, wealthy patients literally wore the teeth of fallen soldiers in their mouths. It was gruesome recycling, but it worked. Eventually, the supply of battlefield teeth dried up, and dentists had to rely on donors or animal substitutes. Still, the phrase Waterloo teeth remained shorthand for high-quality dentures, which is quite possibly the darkest fashion trend in history. Let's float gently over to the tools of the trade. By the 19th century, dental chairs became a thing. Before, you might sit on a kitchen stool or random wooden seat, but now, dentists had specially designed chairs with adjustable heights and headrests. They looked respectable, almost comfortable. Almost thought there were also new instruments, refined forceps, hand-powered drills, and scalers. Still painful, but more precise than medieval pliers. And with anesthesia, patients could at least avoid the trauma of feeling everything in real time. One early drill was nicknamed the clockwork drill because it worked by winding a spring mechanism. Dentists would crank it up and then apply it to your tooth as the gears whirred. Romantic in theory, nightmarish in practice, of course. Not everyone trusted anesthesia right away. Some patients insisted on going without, either out of fear of the chemicals or pure stubbornness. Victorian newspapers occasionally published horror stories of people who refused gas, only to faint from the pain mid-procedure. Others worried anesthesia was immoral. After all, wasn't suffering part of God's plan? Leave it to the Victorians to moralize toothaches. Now, let's talk about Queen Victoria herself. While she wasn't especially famous for her teeth, she did set trends. Her fondness for sweets, she had a notorious sweet tooth, didn't help her dental health. And her children followed suit. There are records of several of her 9 children suffering from tooth decay early in life, which is what happens when the royal nursery is stocked with candies and puddings. Victoria also made dentistry fashionable in a strange way. She had her own court dentist who became something of a celebrity. If the Queen endorsed dental care, then of course the middle classes had to follow. Dentistry was no longer seen as a grim necessity. It was a marker of refinement. Meanwhile, across the pond, American dentistry was booming. The United States established the first dental school in 1840, the Baltimore College of Dental Surgery. This was a huge step. Dentistry was now a recognized medical profession, not just a side hustle for barbers. Graduates received formal training in anatomy, surgery, and hygiene. By the late 1800s, America was leading innovations in dental science. Vulcanized rubber became a popular material for denture bases, cheaper and more durable than ivory. This made dentures accessible to the middle class, not just elites. And of course, American dentists embraced anesthesia with enthusiasm. Tooth extraction went from torture to something that could almost be called routine. Almost. Let's not forget the Victorian obsession with hygiene. This was the age of moral lectures about bathing, hand washing, and proper grooming. Toothbrushes became widely available, often made with bone handles and animal bristles. Tooth powders were sold in little tins, marketed with flowery language about pearly smiles and sweet breath. Some powders contained chalk, baking soda, or charcoal fairly harmless abrasives. Others still used acid or pumice, which slowly destroyed enamel. Marketing was powerful, but science wasn't always keeping up. Still, the ritual of brushing twice a day became part of middle-class respectability. A clean mouth was no longer just about avoiding pain, it was about social image. If you wanted to be taken seriously in Victorian society, you brushed. Or at least pretended to. Now, let's ease into the darker side again. Despite anesthesia, dentistry was still terrifying. The fear of the dentist, what we now call dental anxiety, was already well established. Children dreaded the chair. Adults postponed visits until infections got unbearable. The sound of a drill, even the hand crank kind, Made stomachs not dot, there are accounts of patients fleeing mid-appointment, bolting from the dentist's office in sheer panic. Some never returned, preferring to live with toothache rather than face the instruments. Anesthesia helped, but the reputation of dentistry as torture lingered well into the century. Let's soften into a closing image for this part. Picture a Victorian parlor, gas lamps glowing, a piano tinkling in the corner. A gentleman smiles politely, revealing gleaming porcelain dentures. A lady hides a wince behind her fan, nursing a cavity she's too afraid to have filled. Meanwhile, across town, a dentist in a respectable black suit winds up his clockwork drill, preparing for the next patient. Outside, a chemist arranges tins of tooth powder in the shop window, promising pearly smiles to anyone who can spare a few shillings dot. It's all very proper, very refined, very modern. And yet, underneath, the same story persists: pain, decay, and the eternal battle against sugar and time dot in the next part. Will float into the 20th century, when electric drills, fluoridated water, and modern orthodontics changed dentistry forever. It finally started looking like the field we know today, though. Let's be honest, still nobody enjoys going to the dentist. Alright, let's step gently into the 20th century. Cars are rattling down new roads. Radios are buzzing with jazz. Airplanes are wobbling through the sky. And dentistry, believe it or not, is finally catching up. For the first time in history, people could actually hope to keep most of their teeth into old age, which is a huge leap forward considering that just a few generations earlier, losing your teeth by 40 was practically guaranteed. Let's start with the electric drill. Invented in the late 1800s, it became standard in dental offices by the early 1900s. Compared to hand crank drills, it was faster, more efficient, and more precise. Which sounds good, until you remember the noise. The high-pitched whine of the electric drill became one of the most dreaded sounds of the century. Even with anesthesia, patients clenched the armrest and prayed for it to be over. Generations of children grew up associating that sound with pure terror. A dentist could calm you, reassure you, promise no pain, but once that whirring started, your body tends to automatically dot progress, yes. Relaxing, no doubt. Meanwhile, anesthesia kept improving. Nitrous oxide and ether were joined by Novocaine. Introduced in 1905, this local anesthetic allowed dentists to numb a specific tooth, instead of knocking you out entirely. A genuine game changer. Now, fillings and extractions could be done with minimal pain. Well, theoretically. Some dentists skimped on the Novocaine, either to save money or because they thought patients were exaggerating, which meant many people still endured procedures half-numbed, swearing under their breath while the dentist insisted. Almost done. One of the biggest 20th century revolutions was fluoride. In the early 1900s, researchers noticed that people living in certain parts of the United States, particularly Colorado, had oddly stained but very strong teeth. After years of study, they realized it was due to natural fluoride in the water dot. By the 1940s, public health campaigns began adding fluoride to municipal water supplies. Cavity rates plummeted. Children who would once have lost half their teeth by adolescence were suddenly growing up with healthy smiles. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Conspiracy theories quickly popped up, claiming fluoridation was a government mind control plot. The Cold War didn't help. Paranoia was basically a national pastime. Still, fluoride worked, and dentistry has never looked back. Now, let's float over to orthodontics. The 20th century made straight teeth a cultural obsession. Braces, once experimental, became common. Early versions were clunky metal contraptions with wires and headgear. Children dreaded them, but parents insisted, because by the mid-century, straight teeth weren't just a medical concern. They were tied to beauty, success, and social class. Hollywood played a huge role here. Movie stars flashed dazzling, perfect smiles on screen. Audiences looked at their own crooked teeth in the mirror and felt inadequate. Dentists capitalized, offering orthodontic corrections as a path to glamour. By the 1950s, braces were practically a rite of passage for middle-class kids. And let's be honest, few things scream 20th century childhood trauma, like being forced to wear headgear to school. Cosmetic dentistry boomed in other ways too. Whitening treatments, porcelain crowns, and veneers became popular after World War II. For the first time, dental care wasn't just about survival, it was about vanity. Take Hollywood itself. Silent film stars like Rudolph Valentino and Clara Bow were famous for their photogenic smiles, which encouraged studios to hire dentists specifically for actors. By the time of Talking Pictures, the Hollywood smile had become iconic. White, straight teeth were suddenly part of the package for fame. This filtered down to ordinary people too. If you wanted to look modern, professional, or attractive, you needed a bright smile. The era of the crooked, gap-toothed aristocrat was over. Dentistry wasn't just medical anymore, it was aspirational. Let's glide back to the darker side. Though, because some things never change, dental fear persisted. Even with Novocaine, even with fluoride, people dreaded the chair. The smell of antiseptic, the glint of instruments, the whine of the drill, it all triggered anxiety. Children especially hated checkups. School dental programs, meant to improve public health, sometimes traumatized entire generations. Imagine lining up in a gymnasium, waiting your turn while classmates scream in the background. Free dental care? Yes, but also lifelong phobias. There were also grim realities behind the progress. Early in the century, many dentists still reused instruments without proper sterilization. Cross-infections were common. Patients sometimes left with hepatitis or other illnesses they hadn't walked in with. It wasn't until the rise of germ theory and stricter medical standards that sterilization became routine. And then there were the dentures of the elderly. Despite advances, many people born before fluoride still lost most of their teeth. Full dentures remained a normal milestone of aging well into the 20th century. Ads in the 1950s proudly declared how new plastic dentures could give Grandma her smile back, ignoring the discomfort and awkwardness of wearing them. Of course, dentistry also got caught up in modern marketing. Toothpaste brands flourished. Colgate, Crest, and others filled magazines and radio shows with jingles promising freshness and beauty. Fluoride toothpaste, launched in the 1950s, was advertised like a miracle product. By mid-century, brushing twice a day with commercial paste was universal. Compare that to the medieval rag and ashes routine. 1,000 years of progress, and finally, teeth were getting a fighting chance. Let's not forget the wars. Both world wars influenced dentistry in surprising ways. Soldiers were often rejected from service due to poor teeth, so governments invested in dental care to improve enlistment. Military dentists pulled, filled, and replaced teeth on an industrial scale. After the wars, many veterans carried those habits home, expecting regular dental checkups as part of life. In a strange way, global conflict helped normalize routine dentistry. By the late 20th century, dental offices began to resemble the ones we know today. Bright lights, reclining chairs, suction tubes, and high-speed drills were standard. Anxious patients could even request music or mild sedatives. Some dentists marketed themselves as pain-free, trying to erase centuries of bad reputation. But no matter how modern things got, the core remained the same: the human mouth, stubbornly vulnerable to decay, still needing constant maintenance. And, of course, the universal truth that nobody looks forward to a dental appointment. Let's ease into a closing image for this part. Picture a suburban neighborhood in the 1960s. Kids ride bikes past tidy lawns. A mother in a beehive hairdo reminds her children to brush with Crest before bed. In town, a dentist flicks on his bright fluorescent light, adjusts his white coat, and prepares the electric drill for tomorrow's patients. Outside, billboards smile down with gleaming Hollywood grins, promising that with the right toothpaste, anyone can look like a stardot. It's modern. It's scientific. It's commercialized. And yet, beneath the marketing, it's still the same story. Teeth decay, dentists drill, and humanity endures with a forced smile dot in the final part. We'll float into the 21st century with lasers, implants, cosmetic obsession, and maybe a few bizarre experiments. Dentistry may have conquered pain, but it hasn't conquered our dread. Okay, we've floated through centuries of tooth worms, blackened smiles, wooden dentures, and battlefields looted for molars. Now we arrive in the modern day, the 21st century. Smartphones buzz in our pockets, self-driving cars are apparently a thing, and yet humans are still obsessing over their teeth because even after millennia of suffering, vanity wins. And dentistry today is as much about appearance as it is about health. Let's start with the obvious: implants. In the old days, losing a tooth meant living with a gap or wearing dentures that slipped around while you tried to eat soup. But now, titanium implants can be screwed directly into the jawbone. Over time, the bone fuses with the implant, making it as sturdy as a natural tooth dot. It's miraculous, really. A medieval king would have killed for this technology, but of course, it's also expensive. So just like in the past, your smile still reflects your wealth. The peasants may no longer chew on twigs, but plenty of modern people still can't afford implants and settle for the cheaper, clunkier options. Some things never change. Next, we glide into the world of cosmetic dentistry. Whitening strips, laser bleaching, veneers. It's an entire industry built on the idea that teeth should be unnaturally white. Historically, remember, black teeth once signaled wealth. Now it's the opposite. A gleaming white smile is a symbol of success, beauty, and health. Which is ironic because natural teeth aren't supposed to be perfectly white. They're usually slightly off color, but modern culture doesn't care. If your smile doesn't look like it was photoshopped, you're a failing dot, so people bleach. And bleach. Sometimes too much, stripping enamel until their teeth ache. Dentists warn about over-whitening, but the obsession continues. Celebrities show off dazzling veneers on red carpets. Influencers promote whitening kits. And ordinary people quietly feel inadequate about their slightly yellow molars. Now, let's talk about braces, or rather their modern cousin, clear aligners. In the late 20th century, braces were a rite of passage. Wires, brackets, elastic bands, an entire generation posed for school photos with shiny metal smiles. But in the 21st century, Invisalign and other brands promised a discreet alternative. Transparent plastic trays that gradually shift your teeth into place. Much more fashionable. Much less traumatic dot, of course. They're also costly. So once again, orthodontic perfection remains a class marker. Straight white teeth are practically a passport into middle-class respectability. Crooked or stained teeth? Still stigmatized, just like in the Renaissance dot now. Let's glide into the high-tech stuff, lasers. Yes, dentistry now uses lasers. They can cut soft tissue, zap cavities, or whiten teeth faster than old methods. It sounds futuristic, but in practice, it's still dentistry. You're still lying back in a chair, mouth open, while someone pokes around. A laser doesn't change the basic discomfort of being vulnerable in a dentist's office dot. Then there's digital imaging. Instead of wax molds, dentists can now scan your mouth with 3D cameras. Orthodontists can show you a computer simulation of what your teeth will look like after treatment. It's slick, but for all the bells and whistles, the core routine drills, fillings, extractions remains the same. Public health also shifted. Many countries adopted national dental care programs, at least partially. Others left it to the private sector. The result is uneven. In some places, regular cleanings and braces are standard. In others, dental care is a luxury. And globally, billions still live without access to even basic extractions. So while we talk about lasers and implants, remember, toothache remains one of the most common untreated health problems worldwide. Somewhere, right now, someone is still tying a string to a doorknob and slamming it shut to yank a tooth. Progress isn't universal. And then, of course, there's the fear. Dental anxiety hasn't gone away. Even with modern anesthetics, gentle dentists, and soothing waiting rooms with aquariums, people dread appointments. The whir of the drill, the sterile smell, the loss of control, it still triggers nerves. Children squirm. Adults procrastinate. Entire sitcom episodes have been built around avoiding the dentist. After thousands of years, dentistry is more advanced than ever, and still universally disliked. Some traditions are eternal. Let's pause to float over the cultural side. The obsession with teeth in the 21st century has reached almost absurd levels. Think about the rise of celebrity culture. Paparazzi photos zoom in on every flaw, including teeth. If a star shows up with crooked incisors, tabloids speculate about their health. If their teeth are too white, people mock the fake look. It's a no-win situation. Then there are social media filters. Apps now digitally straighten and whiten teeth automatically. Young people grow up seeing themselves with perfect eye-edited smiles, then feel self-conscious in real life. The result? More cosmetic dentistry appointments than ever. There's also the quirky world of dental tourism. Need implants, veneers, or braces, but don't want to pay domestic prices? Fly abroad. Entire industries exist in countries like Turkey, Mexico, and Thailand, offering package deals, flights, hotels, and a brand new Hollywood smile for a fraction of the cost. Of course, outcomes vary. Some patients come home thrilled. Others return with botched work and a new set of problems. But the trend shows how globalized dentistry has become. Even our molars are part of international trade now. Let's not forget the bizarre experiments of modern times. Stem cell research aims to grow new teeth from scratch. Scientists are testing bioengineered enamel to repair cavities without fillings. There are even prototypes for smart toothbrushes that track your brushing habits and nag you via smartphone notifications. Imagine being guilt-tripped by your toothbrush. That's the future, apparently. And yet, despite all this technology, the human mouth hasn't fundamentally changed. Teeth still rot. Gums still recede. Plaque still builds up. We've come a long way from medieval pliers and frog poultices, but we haven't escaped biology. So let's float toward the end of this long, drowsy journey. Picture a modern dental clinic, white walls, bright lights, and a friendly dentist wearing a pastel mask. A patient reclines nervously in the chair. A tray of gleaming tools waits nearby. There might even be a laser or a 3D scanner humming softly in the corner. It's all very high-tech, very clean, very modern. And yet, deep down, it's the same ritual it's always been. Human beings trying desperately to preserve the one part of their bodies that refuses to cooperate. Teeth. Tooth warms to fluoride. From battlefield dentures to porcelain veneers. From urine rinses to whitening strips. It's a story of pain, vanity, and survival. And as you close your eyes, drifting into sleep, remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is laughing in the afterlife. Because despite all our technology, despite implants and lasers, we're still afraid of the dentist. Some things never change.